The clock on the wall of the break room at Plant 4 showed 5:23 a.m. Same as always, thought Walter Yates, same down-to-the-minute arrival time he'd maintained since the first day he punched in at General Motors. 32 years and counting. The habit was so ingrained that his body refused sleep after 4:15 a.m. regardless of what shift he was on. Today was no different except for the knot in his gut. Walter poured coffee from the industrial-sized percolator into his thermos. Black, no sugar. The smell mingled with the perpetual scent of the plant, machine oil, hot metal, and the peculiar smell of the assembly line that couldn't be named but every worker recognized. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everyone in the same sallow glow that made even the youngest guys look tired. "Morning, Walt," said Frank Poloski, swinging open his locker. "You see the journal this morning?" Walter shook his head. Don't read that rag anymore. But he had. He'd seen the headline about GM's fourth-quarter losses. It was the third consecutive quarter of bad news, and the rumors had been building like a thunderhead over Saginaw. More cuts coming, more layoffs, maybe even a plant closing. They're saying the bigwigs from Detroit are coming today. Somebody saw suits checking in at the Holiday Inn last night. Walter screwed the cap on his thermos tight enough to whiten his knuckles. "They're always saying something, Frank." Frank's face crinkled with worry lines that hadn't been there a decade ago. "My cousin in Flint says they're shutting down half his department next month." Walter didn't respond. He didn't want to hear it. He'd worked at Plant 4 since 1976, back when the Saginaw division was still cranking out steering gears for practically every GM vehicle on American roads. Back when "made in Saginaw" meant something. Back when he'd believed that giving 30 years to a company guaranteed you'd have a secure retirement. The 5-minute warning bell clanged, and Walter headed toward his station on the assembly line, his steel-toed boots squeaking against the concrete floor. The line was already moving, an endless metal snake carrying components past each station where they would grow incrementally closer to completion. Walter's portion of the line handled gear housings. His job was to inspect and secure 6 specific bolts on each unit that passed. 6 bolts, tightened to precise specifications, 457 times per 8-hour shift. That's what Walter Yates was worth to General Motors. 6 bolts done right. The first housing slid into place at his station. Walter picked up his pneumatic torque wrench, its familiar weight an extension of his arm. He'd gotten so good at this he could practically do it blindfolded, muscle memory taking over as he positioned the socket over the first bolt. The wrench hissed and bucked slightly, tightening to exactly 75 foot-pounds of torque before automatically stopping. Second bolt, hiss and buck. Third bolt, his mind wandered as his hands continued their practice dance. Fourth bolt, fifth bolt, sixth bolt. Next housing. Somewhere behind him on the floor, a supervisor was giving a tour to 3 men in suits. Walter caught a glimpse of them out of the corner of his eye, crisp white shirts, ties the color of money, leather shoes that had never seen a drop of machine oil. The suits never came with good news. They came with clipboards and efficiency studies and reduction plans. The next housing arrived. Walter positioned his wrench. In 1976, he'd been 23 years old with a pregnant wife and a 2-year mortgage on a little ranch house on Adams Boulevard. His father-in-law had gotten him the job at GM. "You stick with the general," the old man had told him, "and you'll never have to worry about putting food on the table." And it had been true. While the rest of the country endured the stagflation of the Carter years and the recession of the early 80s, the Saginaw division plants had kept chugging along. There were temporary layoffs now and then, the dreaded blue slips, but never for long. The Japanese cars were taking a bite out of American auto sales. Everyone knew that, but GM was too big to fail. And Saginaw made steering components for every division: Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, Cadillac. As long as GM made cars, Saginaw would make steering gears. That was the natural order of things. Walt had believed it so completely that he'd gotten his son a job at Plant 2 right out of high school. "Why waste money on college when you can make union wages right now?" he'd argued with Melanie when she'd suggested we might want more education. "I never went to college and we've done all right." First bolt, second bolt. Third bolt. Now it was 2008 and nothing was certain anymore. The plant was down to a skeleton crew compared to its heyday. The company had spun off Delphi in 1999, separating the parts divisions from the auto manufacturing business. Walter had been assured nothing would change, then Delphi went bankrupt in 2005 and everything changed. Now the rumors were saying GM itself might file for bankruptcy protection. The unthinkable was suddenly thinkable. Fourth bolt, fifth bolt, sixth bolt, the next housing arrived. Walter repeated the process, but his eyes followed the suits as they continued their tour. One of them was taking notes. Walter had seen men like him before, counting heads, measuring productivity, calculating how many humans could be replaced by automation. The lunch whistle blew and Walter set down his wrench. His lower back ached from standing in the same position all morning. At 55, his body kept a tally of all the repetitive motions, all the lifting, all the standing on concrete floors. The pain had become a constant companion, like a second shadow that grew darker and heavier with each passing year. The break room was buzzing with nervous conversation. Walter sat at his usual table with Frank and a couple of other line workers from his section. He unwrapped the sandwich Melanie had made him, roast beef on wheat, same as Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for the last 20 years. Tuesday and Thursday were ham and cheese. "They're shutting down Janesville Assembly," said Dewing from the testing station. "My brother-in-law just called me. December 23rd is the last day. Merry Christmas, right?" Walter took a bite of his sandwich, chewing slowly. Janesville was an assembly plant in Wisconsin. That was different. Assembly plants came and went, but component plants like Saginaw were the backbone. "It's those damn fuel prices," Frank said. "Nobody wants the trucks and SUVs anymore. That's what Janesville makes." "It's the Japanese," corrected Dewing. "They're killing us with those little tin cans they call cars." "It's the management," said Hector, who worked 2 stations down from Walter. "All those MBAs who have never worked a day on the line, thinking they know how to build cars from their spreadsheets." Walter stayed silent. He'd heard all these arguments before, had made some of them himself at different times. But lately he'd been wondering if it was something else entirely, something none of them wanted to face. After lunch, Walter returned to his station and the familiar rhythm resumed. Housing arrives, 6 bolts, next housing. When he'd first started, he'd counted each completed unit, taking pride in the mounting total. Now he just watched the clock, measuring the shift in fractions of hours until quitting time. The suits reappeared in the late afternoon, this time accompanied by the plant manager and the union shop steward. Their faces were grim. Walter felt his stomach twist, but he kept working. Housing arrives, 6 bolts. Next housing, it was 10 minutes before the end of shift when the line stopped. An unnatural silence fell over the plant floor. The plant manager stepped onto a platform near the center of the floor, holding a megaphone. "Can I have everyone's attention, please? I need all personnel to gather around." Walter set down his wrench. His hands felt oddly empty without it. Workers converged from all directions, forming a semicircle around the platform. The plant manager's face was ashen. "I'm sure many of you have heard rumors about the future of our operations here in Saginaw. I want to address those rumors directly." Walter felt a cold weight settle in his chest. General Motors has made the difficult decision to cease operations at several facilities as part of its restructuring plan. I regret to inform you that Plant 4 will be among those facilities. A murmur ran through the crowd. Walter stood frozen, the manager's words washing over him like ice water. "The phase-out will begin next month, with complete closure scheduled for December of this year. Human Resources will be meeting with each of you individually to discuss severance packages, early retirement options, and possible relocation opportunities at other GM facilities." Walter barely heard the rest. December. 4 months away? After 32 years, it came down to 4 more months. The drive home that evening was a blur. The late summer sun cast long shadows across Saginaw's streets as Walter's 2004 Buick LeSabre, bought with his GM employee discount, navigated the familiar route to Adams Boulevard. The houses grew shabbier as he got closer to his neighborhood. Once solidly middle class, the area had been declining for years as factory jobs dwindled and property values fell. Walter pulled into his driveway and sat there, engine idling. The house needed paint. He'd been planning to do it next spring. Now he wondered if they'd still be here next spring. Melanie was in the kitchen when he came in, stirring something on the stove. The smell of beef stew filled the house. Wednesday was stew night. Walter stood in the doorway, watching his wife of 34 years as she hummed tunelessly to herself. Her dark hair was streaked with gray now, pulled back in the same practical ponytail she'd worn since the kids were small. "You're late," she said without turning around. I was starting to worry. "Plant meeting," his voice came out flat. Something in his tone made her stop stirring and look at him. Melanie Yates had been reading her husband's moods for over 3 decades. She saw it in his face immediately. "Oh, Walt, they're not." "December. The whole plant." She wiped her hands on her apron and crossed the kitchen to him. Her arms went around his waist, her head against his chest. Walter stood stiffly for a moment, then his arms closed around her. They stayed that way for a long moment, not speaking. What was there to say? Finally, Melanie stepped back, her eyes searching his face. "We'll be okay, we've been through layoffs before." "This isn't a layoff, Mel, they're closing the plant." "Permanently." "Well, maybe they'll offer transfers, you've got seniority." "To where? They're closing plants all over. Janesville is done, Doraville, Moraine, everywhere." Melanie turned back to the stew, stirring with mechanical movements. "We'll figure it out, we always do." Walter sat heavily at the kitchen table. "I'm 55 years old, Mel, who's going to hire me? What else do I know how to do besides tighten bolts on a gear housing?" She didn't answer. The only sound was the soft bubbling of the stew and the ticking of the clock on the wall, a General Motors wall clock with the company logo that Walter had received for his 25th work anniversary. After dinner, Walter sat in his recliner, staring at the television without seeing it. Melanie had called Will to tell him the news. Their son had left Saginaw 3 years earlier when Plant 2 had reduced its workforce. He was in Texas now, working for an oil services company. Their daughter Angie was in Chicago, a nurse who had defied her father's skepticism about college education. "Will says you could probably get on with them in Houston," Melanie said, sitting on the couch with her knitting. "They're always looking for experienced mechanical workers." Walter grunted. Leave Saginaw. The idea was almost incomprehensible. His parents were buried here. He'd been born at St. Mary's Hospital 4 miles away. His life was measured in the streets and buildings of this city. The idea of starting over somewhere else at his age seemed impossible. "I'll figure something out here," he said, eyes still on the television. Melanie's knitting needles clicked softly. "Maybe it's time to think about something different, Walt. Maybe this is, I don't know, an opportunity." Walter looked at her sharply. "An opportunity to do what? Start over at minimum wage somewhere. Watch everything we've worked for disappear." "That's not what I meant. I gave them 32 years, Mel. 32 years of perfect attendance, quality work. Never once filed a grievance, never made waves, and this is what I get." "I know, honey, it's not fair." "Fair?" Walter gave a bitter laugh. "None of it's fair. You know what the executives are getting? Golden parachutes. Millions in bonuses while they run the company into the ground, while they ship our jobs to Mexico and China." Melanie set her knitting aside. "Maybe we should look at your retirement options. You're close to your 30 years for the pension." "The pension?" Walter's laugh was hollow. "You think that's safe? Nothing's safe anymore." That night Walter lay awake long after Melanie had fallen asleep. The bedroom ceiling held no answers, but he stared at it anyway. The world he'd believed in, the world where hard work and loyalty were rewarded, where American manufacturing was the backbone of the economy, where a man could support his family with the work of his hands, that world was vanishing before his eyes. What haunted him most wasn't the loss of the job itself, it was the loss of certainty. The solid ground beneath his feet had turned to quicksand, and he had no idea how to find firm footing again. The next morning, Walter went to work as usual. Nothing had changed on the line. The housing still arrived at his station. He still tightened 6 bolts to precise specifications. But everything felt different, as if the entire plant had been subtly altered overnight. The noise of the machinery now seemed like a funeral dirge, counting down the days until silence would fall permanently. During his lunch break, Walter found himself studying his coworkers' faces. Frank, approaching 60 with 3 grandchildren he doted on, Duane, mid-40s, recently divorced and paying child support for 2 teenagers. Hector, who had just bought a house last year with a 30-year mortgage. What would become of them all? The rest of the week passed in a fog. On Friday, Walter was called to a meeting with HR to discuss his options. The HR representative was a young woman who couldn't have been more than 30, with a sympathetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. She had a folder with his name on it. Mr. Yates, based on your years of service, you qualify for early retirement with a reduced pension. The reduction would be approximately 22% from what you would receive at full retirement age. Walter nodded numbly, trying to calculate what that would mean for their monthly income. Not enough, he suspected. Alternatively, you could accept a severance package of 1 week's pay for each year of service, plus continued health benefits for 6 months. 32 weeks, 8 months of salary, and then nothing. Finally, there may be opportunities for transfer to other GM facilities, though I should caution that these positions are limited and would likely require relocation. Walter stared at the papers she was sliding across the desk toward him. His entire working life reduced to 3 inadequate options on corporate letterhead. I'll need to discuss this with my wife, he said. Of course, we'll need your decision by the end of September to process everything before the closure. The end of September. 4 weeks to decide the course of the rest of his life. That weekend, Walter sat at the kitchen table with Melanie, spreadsheets and calculators spread before them. The numbers were unforgiving. The reduced pension wouldn't cover their mortgage and basic expenses. The severance would buy them time, but not much. And then what? Maybe we should consider selling the house, Melanie suggested gently. Property values are down, but we've got equity. We could find something smaller. Walter's jaw tightened. This is our home, Mel. We raised our kids here. I know, honey, but it's just the 2 of us now. Do we need all this space? Walter pushed back from the table and walked to the window. The backyard was small but neat, with the workshop he'd built himself where he restored old radios as a hobby. Across the fence, Mr. Dombrowski was mowing his lawn. He'd been their neighbor for 20 years. Beyond that, the spire of St. Stanislaus Church was visible, where they'd attended Mass every Sunday since moving to the neighborhood. Everyone's leaving, he said softly. Have you noticed? The Williamsons moved to North Carolina last spring. The Johnsons' house has been for sale for over a year with no takers. Every other house on the block has new siding or a fresh coat of paint except ours and the foreclosures. Melanie came to stand beside him, her hand on his back. Saginaw has been through hard times before. Not like this, Walter turned to face her. This isn't a downturn, Mel, this is the end of something. I don't think it's coming back. The following Monday, Walter's work crew was called into a meeting with the plant manager and the union representative. They were told that the current production run would be completed by mid-October, 2 months earlier than initially announced. After that, only a skeleton crew would remain to decommission the equipment. What happens to the machinery? Someone asked. Some of it will be relocated to other facilities, the plant manager said, his eyes not quite meeting theirs. The rest will be sold or scrapped. Scrapped? Walter's hands clenched into fists. Equipment worth millions, specialized machinery that had been maintained meticulously for decades, would be sold for pennies on the dollar or melted down. Just like the men who operated it, deemed obsolete and discarded. That evening, instead of going straight home, Walter drove through downtown Saginaw. He passed boarded-up storefronts and empty parking lots where busy shops had once stood. He drove by the old Rust Belt brewery, now closed, where workers used to gather for beers after their shifts. The giant mural on its brick wall, Saginaw, the manufacturing heart of mid-Michigan, was fading, peeling away like an old scab. He turned down Michigan Avenue, past the county courthouse where he and Melanie had gotten their marriage license, past the hospital where both his children had been born. Every landmark held memories, every street corner was familiar. This wasn't just where he lived, it was who he was. Walter found himself pulling into the parking lot of the Lumberjack, a bar frequented by plant workers. He rarely drank, a beer or 2 on weekends maybe, but today he felt a powerful need to be among people who understood what was happening, who felt the same sense of loss and confusion. The bar was dimly lit and half empty, unusual for a Monday evening. Walter took a stool at the counter and ordered a beer. 2 stools down, he recognized Hector from the line. "Hey, Walt," Hector said, raising his glass in greeting. His eyes were slightly unfocused, not his first drink of the evening. "Hector," Walter nodded, accepting his beer from the bartender. "Thought you didn't drink on work nights." Hector gave a hollow laugh. "What's it matter now? Not like they can fire me, I'm already fired." He took a long swallow of his whiskey. 23 years, that's what I gave them. 23 years and a bum knee and a back that feels like someone's driving spikes into it every morning. And for what? Walter didn't answer, he didn't have to, the question wasn't meant for him. "You know what my old man used to tell me," Hector continued. "He worked 40 years at the same plant in Detroit. He used to say, 'You take care of the company, son, and the company will take care of you.' Biggest lie ever told." Walter sipped his beer silently. He'd believed the same lie they all had. "What are you gonna do?" Hector asked after a while. Walter shrugged. "Not sure yet, you." "My cousin's got a landscaping business in Arizona, says he can use the help." "Thinking about heading out there before winter." Hector stared into his empty glass. "Never thought I'd leave Michigan, born here, figured I'd die here." "Lot of that going around," Walter murmured. By the time Walter finished his beer, Hector had ordered another whiskey and was deep in conversation with someone else. Walter paid his tab and stepped out into the early September evening. The air had a hint of autumn crispness to it, a reminder that the seasons were changing, implacable and indifferent to human concerns. That night, Walter dreamed of the plant. In the dream, he was walking through Plant 4, but it was empty. No machinery, no workers, just vast empty space with dust motes floating in shafts of sunlight from the high windows. His footsteps echoed on the concrete floor. He was looking for something, but he couldn't remember what. The dream shifted, and suddenly the building was being torn down around him, walls crumbling, roof collapsing, but he couldn't move, couldn't escape. He woke with a gasp, heart pounding. Beside him, Melanie slept peacefully. The digital clock read 3:17 a.m. Walter lay back, trying to slow his breathing, just a dream. But the sense of loss, of watching something vital being destroyed, lingered like a physical ache in his chest. The weeks passed with agonizing slowness. Each day at the plant felt more surreal than the last. Equipment was already being prepared for removal. Sections of the line were being shut down as the final production run neared completion. The workforce dwindled as people took early retirement or found other jobs. The cavernous plant grew quieter, emptier. Walter still hadn't made a decision about his options. The deadline was approaching, but every choice felt wrong, like trying to select the least painful form of amputation. Melanie had started looking at smaller houses in the area and at real estate listings in Houston, where Will lived. She didn't push Walter, but he could see the worry in her eyes growing with each passing day. It was the first week of October when Walter arrived at work to find his section of the line roped off. A team of technicians was dismantling the equipment, the same machines he'd worked with for decades, being unbolted, disconnected, prepared for transport. "Where's it going?" he asked his supervisor. "Mexico," came the reply. "They're setting up a new facility in Silo." Walter stared at the partially disassembled machinery. His station, his place in the world for 32 years, was being boxed up to be shipped across the border, where workers would do the same job for a fraction of his wages. The supervisor handed him a clipboard. "They need you in Section C for the rest of the week. After that." He shrugged apologetically. Walter took the clipboard without a word and headed to Section C, where they were rushing to complete the final components. But his mind wasn't on the work. All he could see was his dismantled workstation, tagged and crated for its journey south. All he could think about was how easily he'd been replaced, not by a machine, which might have been easier to accept, but by another man, hungrier and more desperate, willing to work for less because less was still better than nothing where he came from. At lunch, Walter didn't go to the break room. He wasn't hungry. Instead, he wandered through the plant, walking slowly past sections he rarely had reason to visit. Some were already empty, machinery gone, nothing but bolt holes in the concrete floor and ghostly outlines where equipment had stood for years, protected from the plant's grime by their own presence. He found himself in the old tool and die section, now mostly unused since those functions had been outsourced years ago. A single worker was there, an old-timer named Ray who had to be past 65 but had refused all retirement offers. "What will you do, Ray?" Walter asked, surprising himself with the question. Ray looked up from the intricate metal piece he was hand-finishing. Same thing I've always done, make parts. But when the plant closes. Plants close. Skills don't. Ray held up the component he was working on. I learned this trade from my father who learned it from his, been doing it 50 years. Someone always needs a skilled toolmaker. Not around here they don't, Walter said. Ray set down his tools and gave Walter his full attention. You know your problem, Walt. You think you work for GM, you don't, you never did. Walter frowned. What are you talking about? I've got 32 years on the clock. You've got 32 years of experience making things. That's what you do, you make things that work. GM just happened to be the company paying you to do it. Ray picked up a fine file and resumed his work. The company isn't your life, the work is. Figure out the difference and you'll be okay. The words followed Walter for the rest of the day, echoing in his mind as he went through the motions of his temporary assignment in Section C. What was his work really? What had he actually done for 32 years? He'd maintained quality standards, he'd solved problems, he'd ensured that components fit together properly, he'd been part of a process larger than himself. But when he tried to picture himself doing those things somewhere else, his mind went blank. His identity was so wrapped up in this place, this company, that he couldn't imagine existing outside of it. That evening, Walter stopped at the grocery store on his way home. As he pushed his cart down the aisle, he overheard two women talking. Did you hear about the plant? Yes, such a shame, my brother-in-law works there. Says they're all scrambling to figure out what to do next. This town is dying, first steering gear, then the sugar company, now this, what's going to be left? Nothing but fast food and Walmart jobs. My son's finishing high school this year. I told him, don't you dare stay in Saginaw, there's nothing here for you. Walter moved on quickly, not wanting to hear more, but the women's words had struck a nerve. Was that what Saginaw had become? A place to flee from rather than a place to build a life? He found himself in the international foods aisle, staring at products he never bought. On an impulse, he picked up a bottle of hot sauce with a Spanish label, made in Mexico. He studied it for a long moment, then placed it in his cart. At home, Walter set the grocery bags on the kitchen counter. Melanie looked at him curiously when he took out the hot sauce. Since when do you like hot sauce? Walter turned the bottle in his hands. It's made in Mexico. Maybe by someone working at the plant where they're sending our equipment. Melanie's expression softened with understanding. She touched his arm gently. Oh, Walt. I keep thinking about them, the workers down there. Do they know where these machines are coming from? Do they know about the men who ran them for decades? Do they care? They're just people trying to make a living, same as us, Melanie said. Walter nodded slowly. I know. That's what makes it so hard. I can't even be properly angry because they're just doing what I'd do in their place, taking what work they can get. He set the hot sauce on the counter and began unloading the rest of the groceries. I've been thinking about what you said about selling the house. Melanie paused in putting away a carton of milk, and maybe you're right, maybe it's time for a change. Her smile was cautious, not quite believing the shift, really. What kind of change are you thinking? Walter took a deep breath. I don't know yet, but I can't keep waiting for things to go back to how they were. They're not going to. That night, Walter brought home a cardboard box from work. He set it on the kitchen table and began filling it with papers, pension documents, health insurance forms, severance options, real estate listings Melanie had gathered. If he was going to make a decision, he needed to understand all the facts, all the possibilities. He worked late into the night making notes, calculating figures. The reality was stark. Even with his pension and severance, staying in Saginaw would be difficult. Jobs comparable to what he'd had at the plant simply didn't exist anymore. He could take something at lower pay. The hospital was always hiring maintenance workers, and there were similar positions at the college, but the pay cut would be substantial. They could sell the house, but the market was depressed. They might not get enough to pay off the remaining mortgage. Moving to Houston, where Will lived, had better job prospects, but the cost of living was higher. They'd be starting over in a place where they had no connections beyond their son. At their age, the thought was daunting. When Walter finally went to bed long after midnight, Melanie stirred and rolled toward him. Did you decide? She murmured sleepily. Not yet, but I'm working on it. She touched his face in the darkness. Whatever you choose will make it work, we always have. The next day at work, Walter was reassigned again, this time to help inventory parts that would be shipped to other facilities. It was mind-numbing work, counting, labeling, recording, but it gave him time to think. As he worked his way through bins of components, some of which he'd helped assemble over the years, a plan began to take shape in his mind. At lunch, he sought out Ray in the tool and die section. "You said someone always needs a skilled toolmaker," Walter said without preamble. "Who, where?" Ray looked up from his sandwich. "Depends what you can do." "What are your skills, really?" Walter thought about it. "I know the steering systems inside and out. I can troubleshoot problems, spot defects, maintain equipment." "That's a start." Ray wiped his hands and stood up. "Come with me." He led Walter to a workbench covered with technical drawings and components in various stages of completion. "What do you see here?" Walter studied the items, prototype parts, custom work. "That's right. Been doing side jobs for years. Small manufacturers, restoration specialists, custom car builders, they need parts that aren't made anymore or were never mass-produced in the first place." Walter picked up a small gear, beautifully machined. "You make these here in the plant?" Ray snorted. "Of course not, got my own setup at home. Lathe mill the works, been building it up for 20 years. And there's enough work to make a living." "For me there is. I'm not getting rich, but I don't answer to anyone except my customers." Ray gave Walter an appraising look. "You thinking about striking out on your own?" "Maybe. I don't have your skills with the machines, but I know the parts. I know what they do, how they fit together, what can go wrong with them." Ray nodded thoughtfully. "Knowledge like that is valuable to the right people. The trick is finding them." For the rest of the day, Walter's mind raced with possibilities. He had contacts from his years at the plant, suppliers, quality control people, engineers. He knew the catalogs of parts going back decades. And he had his hobby, restoring old radios, which had taught him patience and precision with detailed work. Could he create a new place for himself, combining his knowledge of automotive systems with his skills for restoration? It seemed far-fetched, a desperate grasp at straws. But it was also the first idea that had excited him since the closure announcement. That evening, instead of going straight home, Walter drove to the public library. He hadn't set foot in the place since helping Angie with a school project years ago, but he remembered they had computers with internet access. His own computer skills were rudimentary at best, enough to check email and read news sites, but he needed information. The librarian showed him to an available computer and helped him get started. Walter spent an hour searching for information about automotive restoration businesses, parts suppliers for vintage cars, and shops specializing in GM vehicles. He printed out pages of information, feeling a growing sense of possibility. When he got home, Melanie was waiting, worry evident on her face. "Where have you been?" "I tried calling your cell." Walter realized he'd left his phone in the car. "Sorry, I was at the library doing some research." He set his folder of printouts on the table. "I think I might have an idea. Something I could do after the plant closes." Melanie's expression shifted from concern to curiosity as Walter explained his nascent plan. He could start small, working from his garage workshop, using his knowledge to source hard-to-find parts for restoration projects. He could leverage his contacts in the industry to build a network of customers and suppliers. Over time, if things went well, he might even expand into custom fabrication. "It wouldn't pay like the plant job, at least not at first," he admitted. "We'd have to tighten our belts, maybe downsize the house like you suggested." "But you'd be your own boss," Melanie said, understanding immediately what that meant to him. Walter nodded. "No more worrying about plant closures or layoffs, no more suits from Detroit deciding my fate." "It sounds risky," Melanie said cautiously. "It is, but staying here waiting for another factory job that's never going to come seems riskier." Walter spread the printouts on the table. "I've been doing some calculations. If I take the early retirement with the reduced pension, that gives us a base income, not enough to live on but enough to take some pressure off while I build the business. We could sell this house, buy something smaller with lower taxes and utility costs. I could convert the severance pay into startup funds for equipment and inventory." Melanie studied the papers, then looked up at her husband. The spark in his eyes, the energy in his voice, these had been missing for months, replaced by a defeated weariness that had frightened her more than she'd admitted. "If this is what you want to do, I'm with you," she said simply. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of planning and preparation. Walter submitted his paperwork electing early retirement with the pension option. He began talking to his contacts, quietly exploring the potential market for his services. He spent evenings in his workshop, taking inventory of his tools, making lists of what he would need to acquire. At the plant, the final production run was completed. Sections of the factory went dark as equipment was removed. The workforce dwindled further as people were let go in waves. An eerie quiet settled over the once bustling facility. Walter was among the last groups scheduled to finish, assigned to the final cleanup and inventory verification. On his last day, he arrived early as he had for 32 years. The parking lot, once full to capacity with 3 shifts of workers, now held only a scattering of vehicles. The massive complex looked abandoned already, with whole sections dark and empty. He walked through the plant one last time, moving from his first work area to his last, touching machinery that would soon be gone, saying silent goodbyes to the place that had shaped so much of his life. In the break room, someone had hung a banner, "Thanks for the MEMORIS Plant 4. Below it, a sheet cake sat on the table, barely touched. At 4 o'clock, Walter turned in his badge and safety equipment. His supervisor, a man 15 years his junior who would be moving to a plant in Tennessee, shook his hand. "Been an honor working with you, Walt. You're one of the good ones." Walter nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He signed his final paperwork, accepted the small cardboard box containing his personal belongings from his locker, and walked out of General Motors Plant 4 for the last time. In the parking lot, he stood for a moment looking back at the massive structure. The American flag still flew from the pole near the entrance, snapping in the October wind. How many times had he walked through those doors, confident in the permanence of what lay within? How many mornings had he pulled into this lot, his place in the world secure and defined? As he got into his car, Walter noticed something he hadn't seen on his way in, a large "For Sale" sign at the edge of the property. Not just the equipment, not just the jobs, but the entire facility was being discarded, another hulking industrial shell to join the others dotting Saginaw's landscape. The sight should have depressed him, should have reinforced the sense of loss that had dogged him since the closure announcement. Instead, Walter felt something unexpected: relief. The decision had been made, the wait was over. Whatever came next would be different, but it would be his to shape. He started his car and drove away, not looking back. 2 months later, on a bright December morning, Walter stood in the driveway of a small ranch house on the outskirts of Saginaw Township. A sold sticker had been slapped across the "For Sale" sign in the yard of their old house on Adams Boulevard. The moving truck had just departed, leaving boxes stacked in every room of their new, more modest home. The garage had been the selling point for Walter, large enough for a car plus a spacious workshop area with good lighting and electrical outlets. Already, his tools and equipment were arranged on new shelving units along the walls. A workbench stretched across the back, waiting for projects. "Walt, can you come help with this box? It's too heavy for me." Walter went inside to find Melanie attempting to move a carton labeled "Kitchen." He took it from her, grunting slightly at the weight. "What do you have in here, bowling balls?" "Just my good pots and the cast-iron skillet. They add up." She pushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "I forgot how much I hate moving." "Last time, I promise," Walter said, setting the box on the kitchen counter. "At least until we're too old to climb the 3 steps to the front door." Melanie smiled, but her eyes were serious. "Are you sure about this, about staying in Saginaw?" Will called again yesterday. "Says there's a nice house for sale just 2 blocks from them in Houston." Walter had considered it. The pull to be near their son and his family was strong. But in the end, he decided against it. "This is home, Mel, for better or worse, and my business contacts are here. The restoration shops, the collectors, they know me, trust me." He'd already secured his first 2 clients, a restoration specialist in Bay City who needed hard-to-find parts for 1960s Chevrolets, and a collector in Midland restoring a rare 1957 Cadillac. Small jobs, but a start. The doorbell rang. Walter opened the front door to find Ray standing there holding a bottle of champagne. "Housewarming," Ray said, stepping inside. "Though I remember when we used to call it a house cooling." He looked around the small living room approvingly. "Nice place, cozy." "Thanks for coming," Walter said, taking the bottle. "And for all your help getting started." Ray had been invaluable, introducing Walter to potential clients, advising him on equipment purchases, even sharing some of his overflow work. Think nothing of it, self-preservation, really. "I'm getting too old to handle all the jobs coming my way, need someone to pawn them off on." Melanie emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Ray, good to see you, sorry about the mess." "No apology needed. I remember moving days." Ray handed her a small paper bag. "Picked these up on the way, thought you might need them." Melanie looked inside and laughed. "Light bulbs, how did you know? Always the first thing you need in a new place. The previous owners always take the good ones and leave the duds." Walter opened a box labeled glasses and found 3 mismatched ones. He poured champagne for each of them. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his glass. "To new beginnings," Melanie and Ray echoed. Later, after Ray had left and they'd made progress on unpacking the essentials, Walter retreated to the garage, his new domain. He stood at the workbench, running his hand over the smooth wooden surface. On the wall hung a pegboard with outlines drawn for each tool, a system that had served him well in his home workshop and would continue here. The space smelled of sawdust and machine oil, familiar, comforting scents. Through the small window he could see the winter sun setting early, casting long shadows across their new backyard. It was smaller than the old one, but enough for a garden come spring. Melanie had already been planning where to plant her tomatoes. Walter opened a drawer in the workbench and took out a small metal object, the gear housing from the very last unit he'd worked on at Plant 4. He'd pocketed it on his final day, a small act of defiance or remembrance, he wasn't sure which. Now he studied it in the fading light. 6 bolt holes perfectly placed. The part was precision engineered, designed to fit exactly with other components in a complex system, a small but essential piece of a larger whole. He set the housing on a shelf above his workbench, a reminder of where he'd been and what he'd done. Then he turned to the first box of inventory for his new business, parts salvaged from junkyards, pieces purchased from suppliers, components he'd been collecting for years without fully knowing why. Now they had a purpose. Walter Yates, former assembly line worker, newly retired from General Motors, opened his ledger book and began to catalog his inventory. Walter Yates, proprietor of Yates Vintage Auto Parts and Restoration Supply, making his first entry. His hands, calloused from decades of labor, moved with practiced precision. The work was different, but the care, the attention to detail, those remained the same. Outside, Saginaw was changing, struggling to find its place in a post-industrial America. Plants were closing, jobs were vanishing, families were leaving. The city that had once proudly proclaimed itself the manufacturing heart of mid-Michigan was being forced to reimagine itself, to find a new identity. Inside his garage workshop, Walter was doing the same. The factory hadn't defined him after all, the work had. And the work continued, changed but recognizable, evolved but familiar. He wasn't just surviving the collapse of American manufacturing, he was finding a way forward through its ruins, salvaging what was valuable, discarding what wasn't, building something new from the pieces of what had been. As darkness fell outside, Walter switched on his work light. There was much to do before morning. He opened the first box and got started.